Okay. It's an important tip. Yes. How much time do we have, Pumpkin? Oh, okay. Excellent. I knew I was live all along. Go ahead and turn to Leviticus 20. Leviticus 20. Here, let me, I feel like this is crowding me. Slide that back there, man. Okay. So we are all the way up to chapter 20. We feel like we've been in Leviticus for a while. Hopefully it feels rewarding and not like too much of a slog. But there are several things that we should feel kind of impressed by as we've kind of been on this journey of what Leviticus is teaching us. As we think back through all these opening sacrifices and the detail in which they're performed, and then the last several weeks, just as we deal with um, uh, blood and things, and what makes you ceremonially clean or unclean, and sexual integrity and kind of the law of love. And don't worry about saying the wrong thing because there's kind of a lot of things here. But as we look at these things, and some of them are kind of repetitive over and over and over again in Leviticus, what stands out to you? Shout something out. I mean, I suppose if you say lollipops, that's wrong. But like other than that, like yeah.
Every day there's something you should ask restitution for.
Okay.
Whatever, something.
Yeah, just yeah. Every day you're impressed with the idea that there is something I need restitution for. What else?
There's a lot of blood.
Yeah, there's a cost to all this, and over and over and over again, something dies in my place. Anyone else? Although you really kind of nailed it. That's what I was thinking too. Over and over and over, time and time and time again, Leviticus reminds us of our sinfulness. And over and over and over and over again, it reminds us of the cost of that sinfulness. And so we,
That you did something, so go ahead and do that too.
yeah,
It's like,
yeah, you're so sinful that you did some sinful stuff and you don't even remember it. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at tonight, and that's where Leviticus 20 brings us again, is to um, a couple chapters ago, we were talking about some of the same things, but in that chapter, in 18, it's really telling us about just kind of the sinfulness of these things. Now, in 20, we're talking about those same things, but we're talking about the penalties for them, and we see the cost. I read a quote, or heard a quote today. John Chrysostom, I pronounced that wrong, but at one point he was going to be kind of martyred by an empress at the time, and someone brings him news that, hey, they're gonna put you to death. He says, "You return and you tell her that I fear nothing but my sin." And I would say if we had to put a nice bow and define what our culture is like, it would be the exact opposite of that. We fear everything except for our sin. um, so Leviticus 20 brings us kind of to the ugliness and the offensiveness and just kind of the vile nature of our sin, and the cost of that, the penalty for that. Why does God treat certain sins with these severe penalties, and what do these penalties teach us about His holiness and about our sinfulness and about our need for Christ? So let's work our way through this. Is a bit of a long section, but just looking in chapter 20. This the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, You shall also say to the sons of Israel, Any man from the sons of Israel or from the aliens sojourning in Israel who gives any of his offspring to Moloch shall surely be put to death. The people of the land shall stone him with stones. I will also set my face against that man, and will cut him off among his people, because he has given some of his offspring to Moloch, so as to defile my sanctuary and to profane my holy name. If the people of the land, however, should ever disregard that man when he gives any of his offspring to Moloch, so as not to put him to death, then I myself will set my face against that man and against his family, and I will cut off from among their people both him and all those who play the harlot after him, by playing the harlot after Moloch. As for the person who turns to mediums and to spiritists to play the harlot after them, I will also set my face against that person, and will cut him off from among his people. You shall consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am the Lord your God. You shall keep my statutes and practice them. I am the Lord who sanctifies you. If there is anyone who curses his father and his mother, he shall surely be put to death. He has cursed his father or his mother. His blood guiltiness is upon him. If there is a man who commits adultery with another man's wife, one who commits adultery with his friend's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. If there is a man who lies with his father's wife, he has uncovered his father's nakedness. Both of them shall surely be put to death. Their blood guiltiness is upon them. If there is a man who lies with his daughter-in-law, both of them shall surely be put to death. They have committed incest. Their blood guiltiness is upon them. If there is a man who lies with a male, as those who lie with a woman, both of them have committed a detestable act. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood guiltiness is upon them. If there is a man who marries a woman and her mother, it is immorality. Both he and they shall be burned with fire, so that there will be no immorality in your midst. If there is a man who lies with an animal, he shall surely be put to death. You shall also kill the animal. If there is a woman who approaches any animal to mate with it, you shall surely kill the woman and the animal. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood guiltiness is upon them. If there is a man who takes his sister, his father's daughter, or his mother's daughter, so that he sees her nakedness and she sees his nakedness, it is a disgrace, and they shall be cut off in the sight of the sons of their people. He has uncovered her sister's nakedness, and he bears his guilt. We'll kind of stop there, but it goes on, and again, mirroring those things that we saw in the chapter on sexual immorality. Again and again and again, it says, why? Because I am your God. You are my people. God's people are called to a holy separation. Okay, it's okay. It's even desirable if the culture you live in thinks you strange. Okay, that you don't fit with all the cultural norms. That the things that it you find offensive. Why? Israel belongs to God, and so they have God's values. They believe what God says. They follow God's standard. They're not Egyptians. They're not Canaanites. They're not any of the surrounding nations. They're God's covenant people. So we should expect God's people to be different than the culture that's around them. He says there in verse 26, "Thus you are to be holy to me, for I am the Lord, am holy, and I have set you apart from the peoples to be mine." Okay? So as Christians, we are part of this world, but we're not of it. We are kind of pilgrims, travelers here, but our ultimate allegiance belongs to God. And he starts out here, and he's going to give three different categories of just kind of gross sin. And the first is worship of Moloch. We've talked about that a little bit before. Does anybody remember what kind of the key features of worshiping Moloch is? Yeah. Okay. You sacrifice children to Moloch. And And God uses kind of the strongest language here and says, if you do this, it is profaning God's name. Okay? You're not only worshiping a false god, but you're sacrificing something precious that God made in order to worship a false god. Okay? You're destroying an image bearer of God in order to worship a God that does not exist. Yeah. And God says that is an offense to my name. And really there's kind of a good lesson there that false worship, it's very obvious in this case, but it's true in every case, that false worship is destructive. Okay? It destroys the individuals that participate in it. It destroys the communities that it happens in. Okay? And so there's Moloch worship and sacrificing children to this false idol. Then he also talks about mediums. Okay? You talk to mediums, or those that would consult the dead, those that would consult some other kind of mystical way for you to know what the future is, stuff that you don't know. It's so benign, we just put it in the newspaper. You can look and see what your stars are. You can swing by. There's a place when you go to Zanesville, it's just right off the main strip there. You can pop in, you can have your palm read for $10. Okay? What's so offensive about that? Okay? It assumes that there is good things for you to know that your good God refuses to tell you. Okay? That you can go to something other than God to get the information you need to lead your life. So when we seek spiritual knowledge apart from God, it's a kind of spiritual adultery. We've put someone else in our life and we've said, God is withholding good things from me. And I need to find some way to trick the universe into telling me this stuff that I really need to know. Moloch worship, mediums, and then he begins to list all this moral perversion, adultery and incest and homosexuality and bestiality and kind of other sexual perversions. And all this violates God's created order. God has created things to work in a certain way. And he's describing that people disregard his moral order. They disregard the Creator's design for what he made. Okay? So those are all things that we are to be, and God's people here, Israel, was to be separated from. And then he begins to give some very severe penalties. Okay? And it might even seem extreme. It might even seem kind of offensive to us that it's harsh. And maybe there's three of them that he gives, and they kind of go back and forth, and so maybe you even miss them in there. But he describes that there is the death penalty, Moloch worship, cursing your parents, adultery, homosexuality, bestiality, visiting mediums, all brings about the death penalty. He also mentions being cut off from the people, from Israel. Many think this is just exile from being part of the covenant community. Some people say that this being cut off is the idea of kind of a premature death for someone, that the first death is something that the community carries out themselves. They pick up stones and they stone someone, and that being cut off may be God cutting someone off from the land of the living. I tend to think it's exile, but I understand the argument both ways. It could go either way. And then he also mentions just dying childless, that because of some of these relationships, God's judgment is that they wouldn't have children. And so what do we do with all these things where God is saying, like, man, like picking up stones and throwing rocks at someone until they die seems harsh, okay, to kind of our modern ears. And sometimes we get people will talk about, I actually just heard somebody, there's a guy that's kind of like a motivational speaker, And he was like, well, I read, my son was getting into Christianity, and so I read the Bible, and man, I just couldn't help but think God is a real jerk in the Old Testament. He's a real big meanie. And then I really like him in the New Testament. He's great. He's awesome. And all that comes from a failure to understand who God is. This Jesus that he likes now in the New Testament is also the same Jesus that said, all of the law is good. Okay? I'm going to fulfill all of it, not, so what are we looking at here? Well, one thing, it's helpful, I think, to remember that Israel's laws were very humane, just quite literally compared to the nations around them. The idea, we hear an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and we think, wow, that sounds harsh. You gouged out my eye, I'm going to come and gouge out your eye. Until we realize that often the practice in the ancient world was, oh, you hurt me, I'm going to wipe out your entire family. I'm going to respond by wiping out your entire tribe. So the idea of an eye for an eye brings with it this principle of the punishment must fit the crime. Okay? There has to be some kind of equal reckoning of here's the crime and here's how you're punished. And that's an important principle. So actually, God's law here is a restraining kind of punishment. Also, we have to appreciate that all this isn't just, I look and I see something, I'm like, hey, I think that guy's cheating on his wife, and so let's all get stones and kill Bob. Deuteronomy 17, Deuteronomy 19 describes the judicial process. There needs to be multiple witnesses. There's kind of a formal process. There's like an investigation. So there are judicial safeguards for all this. Also, you have to realize that Israel didn't have like a formal police force. There's not a prison anywhere. There's not modern courts like we have now. So therefore, crimes and their punishments had to be abundantly clear. Okay. The community needed to be involved to carry them out. Again, there's not some kind of police system to do it. And it needed to provide a strong deterrent. So that's much of the aim of the law. It says in Deuteronomy 19:20, the rest will hear and be afraid and will never again do such an evil thing among you. Okay? These kind of penalties were meant to be a strong deterrent to perversion and crime and false witness in the Old Testament. And also, I think we can appreciate that some of these punishments are the ceiling, not the floor. They're the maximum punishment that something might be for something. So, so that brings us to, all right, but we're not Old Testament Israel. So what do we do with this today? And so we talked a little bit about, it's either the last time or the week before, the idea of the division in the law. There is the law expresses God's moral character, which doesn't really change. God creates a law about lying. Why? Well, because God is truth, and it's always wrong to lie. It violates God's character. But there's also laws that are just ceremonial in nature, and those were meant to be pictures to point to reveal something to us about our need or about Christ or the gospel. And so all those things we say, well, those are all just fulfilled in Christ. The reason for this lesson is now gone because we have Christ to look at. And then there's like civil laws. We're like, all right, but we're not, those were meant to govern Old Testament Israel, and we are not Old Testament Israel. We might look at those and say there might be some enduring principles that we can bring forward, but we're not trying to institute, Israel's civil laws in America in 2026. At least we're not. Okay? So, what then should we walk away with? Here's what we walk away with. Once again, we should just be impressed that sin is a gravely serious matter. Sin is wicked. It is evil. It is vile. It is gross. It is an offense to God. And we tend to use different words, I think, in the church today. And I understand it, and I use some of these too. But, we tend to talk more about struggles. I struggle with this. Or or a weakness. I have a weakness toward this. Or sometimes I think a word that gets used a lot talking about sin is brokenness. I think all those things are true, but it's not the same as saying iniquity, sin, wickedness, rebellion, evil, idolatry. So sin is very grave, and it's important for us. What do we do with this? Well, we should see how terrible sin is, and we should talk about it plainly, rather than make euphemisms for it. We should talk about sin seriously. I had read an illustration where a pastor was talking about, he used as an illustration, he had a bottle of strychnine, poison. And he said, what if instead of labeling this poison, I labeled it peppermint? Okay. Well, not only is that wrong, but actually now the poison is what? More dangerous or less dangerous? It's more dangerous. Okay? And when we speak softly about sin, I think it makes sin more dangerous, not less. This person said, the milder the label, the more dangerous you make the poison. Okay? So the gospel really only makes sense when we understand the grave nature of sin. So that should be a big takeaway. The other thing is that God's people must not ignore arrogant, flagrant sin. Okay? The Old Testament principle is, well, you need to purge this evil from the camp. What's the New Testament equivalent? Is there one? Is there a New Testament equivalent to this Old Testament idea of evil must be purged from the camp? The church. What specifically in the church, Bob? What specifically in the church do we do? Church discipline, right? Okay. And here's the crazy thing. The vast majority of churches don't know what church discipline is, let alone practice it. Okay. Church discipline is the idea that there is a membership in the church, and if there is someone committing kind of a gross, flagrant, rebellious sin, that Christians that love that person will go talk to them. And if that doesn't work, they bring some people along. And if that doesn't work, you bring it to the church. And if that doesn't work, you remove them from membership. Okay. We see 1 Corinthians talk about this, where Paul is talking about, man, there is a man in your midst that is sleeping with his stepmom. And Paul is enraged. He's like, why are you tolerating this? And he says in 1 Corinthians 5, you need to remove this wicked man from amongst yourselves. Paul talks about something similar in 1 Timothy 1, talks about people being handed over to Satan. In the passage, Matthew 18, that talks about church discipline, Jesus says that you let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Okay? Doesn't mean you don't stone the guy. It doesn't mean you never talk to them again, but now you reckon them as someone not God's people. Okay? Why? Because God's people deal with their sin. God's people are repentant. God's people run to Christ to deal with their sin. And if this person won't do that, then you need to treat them as if they're an unbeliever. Okay? So sin is serious, and sin has to be dealt with amongst God's people. The other thing we should be reminded of is, God is saying over and over again what the judgments for these sins are. We should be reminded that unrepentant sin will be judged. Jesus says in Matthew 10:28, "Fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell." Mark 9:47, "It's better for you to enter into the kingdom of God with one eye, okay, than to be consumed by your lust and by hell." Galatians 6:7, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, he will also reap." Okay? And maybe the best reminder for us is there is something we're supposed to do as a people on a regular basis that reminds us of our fellowship with God and our fellowship with one another. And every time we practice the Lord's table, Pastor reminds us, hey, there is a time to examine yourself. Okay, and why? Because in the example Paul gives, he says there's some of you that's sick and some of you have died because you're participating in something that says, look how close me and God are. And the whole time you're participating in sin that separates you from God. And so sin is gravely serious. We don't ignore sin among us. And we're reminded that God judges unrepentant sin. So we come to this passage again, and we're just reminded that that we need Christ more than ever, because we're not some morally perfect people over the Jews, and like, well, they were screwing up everywhere, but me, I'm pretty great. Time and time again, we are reminded that we can be just as foolish as Old Testament Israel are. We are sinful in all the same kind of ways. All these gross sins that God is talking about judgment for them, we can look right out our door and see them. We can flip on our TV and see them being praised in our culture right now. So we need Christ desperately. And God takes these things so seriously, and we see these strong judgments. Why? Because sins just aren't weaknesses or stumbles or mistakes. They're rebellion against a holy God. So, anybody have any questions or comments or thoughts you want to add? Bob?
I had trouble with, in the Old Testament, they talk about God said someone would be put to death, would be separated from their people. And I wonder if being separated meant the same as being today is being shunned. That they wouldn't do business with them, or they wouldn't recognize them as a part of their community.
Yeah, it's at least that you don't recognize them as God's people.
Okay.
It can be more than that, but it's definitely not less than that. That I'm no longer going to recognize you as God's people. We don't have that in common. Okay, we don't have that kind of fellowship around the feet of the same God. You've put yourself at odds with my God, and then how much more than you participate in anything else at that point? I don't know about business, but you're probably not palling around. You're not playing golf together. You're not bringing our families together. So yeah, there would definitely be some of that, I would think.
What about people that I believe are Christians, but they have an addiction that they can't overcome?
Well, there isn't any of that in this passage. So there's kind of a when you see that there isn't a death penalty for alcoholism, Gene, is I guess the point I'm making. So God is dealing harshly with a particular kind of flagrant, arrogant rebellion sins. This isn't like we've seen other places in Leviticus of, hey, you may have forgotten about a sin that you did. Stone him. Okay? It's so there's a kind of sin. It's like, man, this is too egregious to ignore. And we see that same thing in the New Testament too. There's things that are too egregious to ignore. But that's not to say then we look at every sin and we're saying, oh, well, that's the death penalty or something. Now, that doesn't mean we don't take those seriously. And we shouldn't be surprised that things like substances are addictive. Actually, God describes all sin as people are slaves to sin. He doesn't say, oh, you participated in it nicely and it's easy for you to quit if you want. He says people are in bondage to sin. So when we participate in sins, it enslaves us. So alcoholism, drug abuse doesn't surprise me, but all kinds of other things are addictive too. Gambling is addictive. Pornography is incredibly addictive. Okay? I just read a study the other day. They think pornography is more addictive than cocaine. Okay? So yeah, when we participate in those things, so like all that to say, I just want to balance that out. Like I do think there's things that people struggle with, and I don't want to put them in the classes of these sins, but I also don't want to say, oh, you're addicted to it, you kind of get a pass. God doesn't mind that much. It's like, well, we get addicted to a lot of wicked things.
Do they mostly point to the Ten Commandments, those things? That they have these violent, punishments for?
Most of the time, now not always, but if you go and look at more appearances of kind of the death penalty and being stoned and all those things, they tend to be, it's usually not like for stealing, it's for me damaging another image bearer of God, okay? If I murder you, and things that are just an offense to God. You also see it here for, cursing parents, things, but very oftentimes it's violence toward another person is the most common reason. Anyone else?
The New Testament, I think, and it throws in like, one, it's got like 10 or 15 different, and one of them is drunkenness, and it says something about won't go to heaven. But see, that confuses me because I thought when we're saved, all our sins are forgiven, past, present, future, and we just will lose rewards in heaven. But that would be part of our punishment for doing those things. Mm-hmm. I don't know.
Usually when I was talking about that, I think the passage you're talking about, well, no, maybe I'm thinking of something else. But it says, like, and they that practice them, they that approve of these things. And when John talks about, sins that are, like, man, if you do this, you don't know God. So I don't think it's talking about the times when Christians stumble and sin and do something evil, but they repent and come back. It's the idea of practicing those things. And if that's the pattern of your life, then you don't get to say, hey, I realize I'm a constant drunk. I realize I'm a constant adulterer. I realize I'm a constant thief. But there was this time I walked the aisle, I raised my hand, I signed a card when I was 5, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to heaven. Like, well, when Jesus saves someone and he puts their spirit in someone, he also changes them. And if what you can point to is there's a time I walked the aisle, but there's never been any change in my life, then, and these sins that God says characterizes an unsaved person, you should probably look at yourself as an unsaved person. Anyone else? Let's share some prayer requests.